Hello everybody. So I did, in terms of video popularity, my most popular series a while back concluded, and it was Why Your Stuff Sucks. Started with why your forge burner sucks, and then that led to questions, so that led into why your gas forge sucks, and then that led to questions which led me to do why your coal forge sucks. But I've been hounded by messages from people saying, when are you going to continue the series? Well, the last one didn't raise any more questions, so it was good. And so people were like, well, what about other topics you could talk about? And so I built a list of topics that I want to talk about to continue this series, to do deep dives into parts of blacksmithing and particularly bladesmithing that are otherwise not really explored in the educational or edutainment side of YouTube, which is where I firmly sit, hopefully. So, without further ado, I want to talk about why your etchant sucks. So, many people, when they think of etchant in using, say, Damascus steel or doing a stonewash finish on a blade, they jump straight to what they think of as ferric chloride, or in our case, aqueous ferric chloride, which is the liquid state of ferric chloride. Now, ferric chloride isn't really a knife etchant. It's not a steel etchant. It works just great as one, and it's actually really quite good if you use it right as one, but it's predominantly used in an industrial sense for circuit board etching, because it's really aggressive on copper. And circuit boards usually have some cases, these days they've got much more modern tech, but for a long time they would have a board that was plated fully in copper, and they would print on like a resist of the circuit pattern, and then they would submerge that in ferric chloride, and it eats away the copper wherever the resist is not, leaving behind a perfect pattern of connector traces on an electrical circuit board. But the bladesmithing community, especially after members of the ABS started popularizing Damascus steel again way back in the day, really took to it because it's easily available because of its proliferation in the home circuit industry. And it works really well, especially if you get the conditions right. But there are others that are starting to pop up around the place, and everybody's always talking about the next big thing when it comes to etching. So I wanted to do a video that actually explains what happens during the etching process, how it differs between the different more popular etchants, and why you might want to consider one over the other, or change your setup entirely to actually redo your etching process using what you've already got in order to get better results out of it. So what's really going on when we take a knife and we put it into an etchant? Let's go down to the microscopic scale and take a look. So we're going to cover 4 etchants here, well 5. So the 4 main ones we're going to talk about are ferric chloride, hydrochloric acid or muriatic acid, ferric nitrate, which you may not have heard about, but I bet you've seen, and a 4th one, which is basically pre-made purchasable etchants, professionally made etchants, rather than a homemade jobby. And for that, we're going to talk about the main one that's available out there, and you've probably already wondered when it was going to come up. It's called Gator Piss, which sounds like a very creative name, but it's made by a bunch of boys from Appalachia, and that makes perfect sense when you think about it, that that's what they would call it. So why would there be multiple etchants that are all more popular or less popular in different parts of the community? The reason is the effect that they have on the steel, specifically the manganese steel. Let me explain. What it comes down to is a phenomenon called surface scattering. So surface scattering will affect how shiny or matte an object is. That's why you get different spray paints. You get gloss, and you get matte, and you get satin. All comes down to the surface scattering effect of the finish. And so if we have a perfectly flat, polished surface, which is why you polish Damascus first, when rays of light hit it, you're going to come down, and every one of them is going to hit the surface and bounce off in the same way, which basically makes it a mirror. Mirrors work this way. So the closer something is to a mirror, the less these outgoing rays are going to be diverted from their original course, so we get perfect bounces. Surface scattering happens when the surface here is not perfectly flat and perfectly polished, and so you'll get a uneven surface like this, and because it's uneven, when this beam comes down, it might hit there and go up there. When this beam comes down, it might hit there and go over there. This beam comes down and might hit there and bounce right back there. And so because of that uneven bouncing of light, the surface doesn't look shiny anymore, because the light's being scattered everywhere. Because it's being scattered everywhere, it's going to look particularly matte. What if it wasn't quite as bumpy? It was halfway between them. Well, you might still get your chaotic bouncing, but if you had like a surface that was only a little bit scuffed up, when you get your three beams come down like this, they might largely go in the same direction, but not perfectly. So the amount of diversion of bounce light that happens based on the surface finish is going to affect what the surface finish looks like to our eyes, because our eyes are just photoreceptors basically. So different acids, different etchants, when they eat away at your manganese steel, are going to leave a different surface finish to that manganese steel, creating different looks. So once again, let's go down into the microscopic level, and I'm going to show you what those different effects look like. So first, let's delve down into the crowd favorite, ferric chloride. As it eats away, your nickel layers are going to still stay fairly pristine. Not perfectly pristine, but we'll get to that. And your manganese layers are going to delve down deeper and deeper into valleys. Now, those valleys are going to be textured at the bottom by way of the ferric chloride finding the grain boundaries of your steel and attacking those preferentially. It's going to pit the entire surface of the manganese steel somewhat and rough it up, but the worst affected areas are going to be your grain boundaries. So if you've heat treated your knife properly, your grain should be quite small, and so it gives you this sort of cellular look to the surface finish, which gives a very sort of satin look, a very sort of soft velvety look to the bottom, and it usually gives quite nice blacks. If you think of the whites as being the nickel steel and the blacks as being the manganese steel, your blacks tend to look quite crisp with ferric chloride. And it's why some of the proprietary etchants will use multiple different etchants. Excuse my chickens, they're getting treats at the moment, and Gwen always rants after she gets treats because the treats run out. So the grain boundaries being affected create this sort of cellular structure, which up close looks chaotic like a spider web. But if you imagine that this is happening on a tiny microscopic level, the effect that it has on the light is to create an extremely satin finish when you zoom all the way back out. And that satin finish gives you a nice, flat, non-shiny black. Even if you were to rebuff that surface to get rid of any of the black oxides that have formed, the surface underneath at the bottom of your valleys is going to be a satin finish, almost sandblasted looking. And your highs will be still largely unaffected. That's the benefit of using ferric chloride. But what about the other acids? So I mentioned earlier that there are different types of etchants, and the most common one that people fall into is ferric chloride, which we talked about, aqueous ferric chloride. I call it aqueous ferric chloride because ferric chloride often comes as a solid, as sort of little flakes or crystals that you can add to water. Once you've got it in a liquid solution, we call it aqueous ferric chloride. Sometimes you can call it iron tetrachloride. It's more or less the same thing, it's just a fancier name for it. But it's a circuit board etchant, and it works really well on copper, but it also works great on steel. The limitations of it are its ability to affect the chromium oxides on stainless steel. It's not particularly good at that. But also, one of the big faults with it that tends to lead people to have 2 lots of it in their collection is its ability to get contaminated. Now, ferric chloride, people tend to leave it in their shop for quite a while. You really should refresh it. It is a consumable, and there are things you can do to actually lengthen its life. And the reason it gets bad is it's sort of, acids get used up sort of over time. All the chemists in the audience are screaming at me. They sort of they go bad, and it's usually because of pollutants, and the pollutants are from the things that they have eaten, and it changes it. It's no longer ferric chloride, aqueous ferric chloride. It's something new that's got all these other things in it, in the chemical soup. If you add coffee to water, it's no longer water. It's something else. So the same thing happens to your acid, and ferric chloride is really good at this. It just pulls things off and adds it to itself. It's like, give me some of that. And one of the worst things to put in it, ironically, is copper. So when you etch a Kumai knife, like if you use some of the Baker Forge and tool steels in your knife making, or you yourself make Kumai using cool tutorials made by guys like me, you can pollute your ferric chloride. And what happens is you might etch a Kumai knife or several Kumai knives, and then when you go to etch a normal Damascus knife, you start seeing copper depositing on the surface of the steel, giving you this kind of rusty colored look. It's usually quite a thin coating, but the more you go with this without changing out your ferric chloride, the more strongly that effect is going to happen. And ferric chloride's particularly bad at this. All acids do it to an extent, but ferric chloride's quite bad. So in order to mitigate these problems, a lot of people will do things like agitation, or just simply getting new ferric chloride all the time. You can actually make a thing of ferric chloride, a vessel of ferric chloride, last a heck of a long time if you treat it right. And so one of the things you can do is to clean out the copper. And a way to do this is to put something into your ferric chloride that the free copper ions that are floating around in it finds more attractive than steel. And 2 things pop to mind: aluminium or zinc, solid zinc. Both of these are extremely reactive metals. And if you were to put a piece of aluminium into your ferric chloride tank and agitate it for a while, all of the agitation is going to help move the mixture around. And so all of the free copper ions are going to stick to the aluminium and kind of plate it in a certain way. But the more it gets plated, the more of the copper it's essentially sucking out of your ferric chloride. I wouldn't want to leave it in there for longer than you need to, but once you get it plated pretty well, or it looks like it's not getting any more plated, pull that out, and you've sort of done a flush cycle, so to speak, on your ferric chloride. You'll also start getting sediments at the bottom of the iron, just from the process of putting iron into ferric chloride. Those won't affect your etch so much. That's just muck that can, through agitation, stick to your blade. We'll get into agitation soon, because that's a whole different topic. But the other way to really quickly burn out your ferric chloride is, and this also affects hydrochloric or muriatic acid, if you call it that. They're both the same thing, hydrochloric and muriatic. One thing that causes a lot of problems for people is aeration. A lot of people think that agitation is best achieved through aeration, and they do that by taking a fish tank bubbler, and they'll put that at the bottom of their etch tank, and the bubbles streaming up will actually basically cause the surface, the ferric chloride touching the surface of your blade, to constantly be refreshed. So the theory is sound, but there's one big problem. So when you are etching a blade in ferric chloride or muriatic acid, you are slowly turning parts of it into other chemicals, like we talked about before. But by pumping oxygen through the procedure, you're actually increasing the rate at which that conversion is happening. And the things that it turns into are not as effective at etching as straight ferric chloride or muriatic acid. So the process of prolonging the life of these etchants is about keeping them as close to their original state as possible for as long as possible. So in ferric chloride, as you're pumping oxygen through, it's increasing the rate at which you're forming iron oxychlorides and hydroxides, which are far less effective at etching metal than straight ferric chloride. In hydrochloric acid or muriatic acid, you're making iron oxides and hydroxides faster. You're also increasing the rate of evaporation of the hydrochloric acid gas that forms, because it off-gasses. It actually off-gasses hydrogen into the room, which is corrosive and nasty to breathe and really needs a lot of ventilation. And when you bubble oxygen through at that rate, it pumps out even faster. So not a good way to agitate. A better way to agitate is to use a magnetic stirrer like they use in labs. They kind of look like this. They're pretty handy because they usually come with speed control. You definitely want speed control. And they usually come with the ability to control the temperature of the mix, because making an etchant warmer will make the reaction happen faster. When it comes to stainless steels and why they're very difficult to etch most of the time, is that stainless steel is stainless because it contains above a certain amount of an element called chromium in the mix of the alloy. And that chromium causes the surface of the steel to form chromium oxides, which happen very, very readily. And chromium oxides act like a natural resist to etching, a little bit like the nickel content does. However, it does it across the entire piece, despite the fact that if you have Damascus made of stainless, you'll have different grades, one which actually has the nickel content, one which has the manganese, much like you would otherwise, except they're all covered in this layer of iron or chromium oxides which are protecting it. So you need to eat through the chromium oxides first before you can start getting your depth of difference based on the nickel and manganese contents of the steel. In fact, it's this chromium oxide layer that it helps explain why we need to clean our steel so much before we etch, and so well, because any residual coating of maybe oils from your skin or dust from an old workshop, or even just natural oxides which have formed because you've left the thing exposed to air for quite a while, or maybe wax coatings, oil that you've been using for rust preventative during your construction of the piece. Any number of things, lint even, can form a sort of a protective layer on the surface of your steel that stops the etchant from being able to get to the layers of the steel. So we clean it properly first. Now, some people have big arguments about this online, about what is the best way to clean steel before etching. And science kind of points in one direction. Some people will use acetone. I'm a big fan of acetone, but it has its ups and downs. Brake cleaner is a really good one, although it's not good to breathe or get on your skin. Degreaser, chemical degreaser that you use when working on cars. But when it comes down to it, if you want the most thorough possible cleaning of all of the surface of your steel, use distilled water with dish soap in it, like Dawn dish soap, and put it in an ultrasonic cleaner, even just a small one that you use to clean jewelry or eyeglasses or what have you. And putting it in there will create ultrasonic waves which create continual agitation, and that dish soap will strip it of anything that would be possibly left on it. And then you can rinse it off in just clear water, preferably distilled water, but it's going to depend on the quality of your tap water. See a lot of people running it under taps, but tap water is often filled with all sorts of other minerals that can create deposits. So if you have a separate vessel of distilled water, you can wash it off in that, and just make sure when you pull it out you don't get any residual soap on it. Now, you might think that leaving it wet before going into the etch is a problem, but it's actually a benefit. And I learned this trick from Stuart Anthony Smith, an incredibly talented maker from South Africa, and I highly recommend looking up his stuff. A lot of the time when you put a knife into etchant, surface tension is going to make it stick in weird ways, especially if you've got little fullers or pinholes or what have you little pockets of air can stick in those places and stick pretty well despite any agitation you might do shaking it around and things. So if your blade is already wet with distilled water when it goes in, it already breaks that surface tension going in, and you are largely going to minimize those issues. A common problem I see with people who use acetone and some degreasers that you find for the automotive industry is that their etches become cloudy. And this often happens as a complaint with certain proprietary etches, which we'll get into later. And they say, oh, it's not a good etchant because the etch is cloudy at the end of it. And the reason that the etch is cloudy is because some of those things, like certain types of acetone, certain brands of degreaser, leave a film. You think of it as a solvent that's going to completely disappear anything that's on the surface, but that's not really the case. You really want to completely clean it, and I've seen people just dip in acetone and then call it good, when really acetone will loosen what's on the surface, but you really have to scrub it off. I find that's effective most of the time because most of my etches are done in straight aqueous ferric chloride. Now, if you're finding you're getting cloudy etches, change your cleaning process. Get a small jewelry ultrasonic cleaner, or one that will fit your knife. You don't necessarily need the ultrasonic cleaner, just a vat of distilled water or demineralized water and Dawn dish soap and a good clean sponge, and give it a real good scrub down. Really rub the whole thing and clean it, and then a separate container with just clear water to wash it off again will do a damn good job. If you really want it to be thorough though, get an ultrasonic cleaner. Nothing beats it. It's what they use in labs. So if you can clean a 2-stroke carburetor with one, you can clean a knife blade ready for etching. Let me tell you, they're powerful things. And they're inexpensive, especially if you do this seriously enough to want better etches. Hydrochloric or muriatic acid is far more aggressive against steel, particularly carbon steel, than ferric chloride. And so you get a much faster etch. And because it's happening so fast, it doesn't have time to preferentially etch grain boundaries. So you just basically get pitting all the way along, microscopic pitting all the way along the surface of your manganese steel. And that creates a fairly even looking finish, but not satiny, not that velvety sort of soft. It's a very rugged, aggressive finish, which on Damascus, where the detail is quite fine, you might not notice the difference between ferric chloride and hydrochloric. You might just think that hydrochloric etches faster, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that. But if you do look closely, there is a marked difference between what the satiny, velvety finish of the ferric chloride looks like versus the aggressive bitumen road finish of the hydrochloric. And for different applications and different looks, that's very powerful. When you mix the two together, you get the speed and the power of the hydrochloric with the more velvety look of the ferric chloride, and you can actually produce a really nice etch. So some people actually swear by using vinegar or acetic acid to do their etches, and a lot of people dump on that because it looks like an ugly etch. It kind of goes gray and mottled looking rather than the crisp, clear blackness that you would normally get through ferric chloride or hydrochloric acid. But there's a mechanism at work which actually makes vinegar, or particularly white vinegar, quite effective. And that's that it's quite gradual in how it etches, and it creates a sort of, it's a gradual and even etch, still affected less by the nickel, resisted more by the nickel, and affecting a manganese. But because it's so gradual, your boundaries of where the different steels are being etched are sort of not as crisp. They're blurred because everything's sort of being worked slower. And it's usually a faster etch that helps get those heights very clearly defined. But it's creating iron acetates while it does it, which can sort of protect the steel from its own etching. And that really slows it down and brings out smaller, finer details than you would normally get. So using vinegar, particularly on a high layer or high detail Damascus, like mosaics and feathers and things like that, doing a vinegar etch first can help establish those differences and bring out finer details in your etch. You then take it out of there, fully neutralize it, clean it, and move it on to a different etchant of choice. Ferric nitrate, on the other hand, is very interesting. Now, I know you've seen this etchant before, and a lot of people speculate as to what it is, and the people who use it tend to not say what it is, primarily because it's not for beginners. And the reason it's not for beginners is it's quite dangerous compared to other acids. While ferric chloride and hydrochloric acid definitely are still dangerous chemicals to have and should be handled with a great deal of respect, particularly hydrochloric because of the gas that it is able to pump off while it's etching. It's not nice stuff. But ferric nitrate really has to be used hot. And it looks like steaming hot orange juice. You've probably seen people use it. I'm fairly certain that the artificery, William Brigham, I think his name is, uses it. I've seen videos, and people always speculate in the comments, is that hot orange juice or perhaps orange juice concentrate that's used to bulk produce it? They think maybe it's acidic because oranges are acidic, a citrus, and they think it might be citric acid. I've seen all these different guesses. What they're using is ferric nitrate, and you really want to use it hot. But because you have to use it hot, it really pumps off some nasty fumes that you don't want to use. You don't want to inhale, I should say. But the benefit of using ferric nitrate is that it creates a really stepped, even etch, and the floor of your valleys ends up looking as clean as the tops of your peaks if you use it right. It's a gradual process. You really want to take your time with it. It's for those really special pieces where it absolutely must go well. But it produces a remarkable finish, an absolutely remarkable finish, like this. Not to say that this is just dipping it in ferric nitrate and you're done. That's a lot of work right there. That's a lot of respect for the Damascus. And a lot of the time, when you get such a nice, crisp, clean divot where you're between your troughs and your peaks and your troughs, you want to round over the edges of those cliffs, and you do that with burnishing. And the best way to do burnishing on Damascus that I've found, at least, is 40 steel wool, 0000, the fine, super fine steel wool. Really aggressively hitting it with that after you've done each etch phase, and you should do multiple etch phases if you want to achieve good results. And the best way to do that is to multi-stage it. Maybe do a short etch with white vinegar, or short for vinegar, to establish your fine details. Then hitting it with hydrochloric after. Don't take it from one to the other. Fully clean it and ultrasonic it and whatnot again. Then take it to your hydrochloric to get your depth. And then once you're done there, fully neutralize it, fully clean it, and take it to your ferric chloride, and you get the surface finish on the bottom starts getting velvety without the aggressiveness of the etch. And once you're done, you now have your physical shape to your Damascus. But the oxides that form, that create the contrast between the highs and the lows, can be a bit fragile. A lot of people will leave the oxides that are left over from ferric chloride because they look nice and black, and they are good. You should have no oxides on the top, because the high points you then sand back with very high grit sandpaper, at least 1200 grit, preferably 1500 or 2000 grit. And you get your highs very polished, mirror polished, and your lows as surface scattered as possible, but in the right way possible, with the corners of the tops burnished with your steel wool and buffing wheels, and hand polished with things like Autosol. It makes for a good Damascus. But you don't worry about your blacks at this point if you want to do good Damascus etching, because the oxides left over from things like ferric chloride and hydrochloric are not particularly stable. They're all right, don't get me wrong, they'll hold up okay, but if you want that piece to really last, that's where coffee comes in, because coffee produces tannic oxides. So where the acids like ferric chloride will leave oxide layers sitting on top of the steel, the tannic acid in particularly shitty coffee actually bonds with the steel and creates a layer that's interwoven with the surface of the steel, creating a much, much stronger bond and less likely to break off and wear away over time. And so what I've done whole videos on coffee etching, but this is why. I wanted to get to the bottom of it and have a really good understanding of what's going on during a coffee etch. Because if you're going to go through the process of getting the physical shape of your Damascus etch right, buffing and polishing the entire thing back to get as much of the oxides, acid oxides, off of the surface, including down in the troughs as possible, then going and doing a full coffee etch, you're going to create a really durable and controlled Damascus finish rather than just sticking an acid for 20 minutes and seeing what's what. And that can be a real problem. Now, this leads to the discussion of the final issue that I wanted to talk about, and that is pre-made etchants. So for the longest time, you may have picked up a bit of bitterness in my voice. All we had access to was... That's Freddy, my rooster. This is a chicken video. What do you expect? So what I found was that you have to make do when it comes to acids. You know, ferric nitrate isn't thought of as specifically for blade steel etching. Ferric chloride is for circuit boards. Hydrochloric acid you usually find at the hardware store for all sorts of like concrete purposes and things like that. There's never been anything specifically for knife makers until recently, when Baker Forge and Tool created Gator Piss. Not a sponsored video. It's really hard to get Gator Piss in my part of the world because they make it over in Appalachia and transporting chemicals worldwide is difficult. I managed to get this because my friend Björn at Nordic Edge got a pallet of it shipped over through whatever means and started selling it here. So not sponsored. I'm not affiliated with them. But I wanted to point out in this video that we've gone through a lot of science. I've used a lot of fancy terms and it sounds very daunting. And all of a sudden you're probably thinking, holy shit, I didn't realize that I was etching wrong and doing all of these things wrong. So now I feel like I can't do anything. Well, if you don't want to have to think about it, the fact that there is a pre-made etchant available now solves that problem for you, really. I still have seen people using oxygen bubblers with Gator Piss. I don't recommend that because it's the primary ingredients of Gator Piss. Most likely, I don't know because it's not written on there, but given the color and the effect, it's most likely something that involves ferric chloride and muriatic acid in some way. And they're going to be in there and they're going to be badly affected by excess oxygenation. So unless I'm completely wrong and they're not involved in the process, it does a good job, by the way. I used it for the first time yesterday, and I've had it for about 2 weeks, but I only used it for the first time yesterday. It does a good job. It does a really good job, and you don't have to think about it. But I did it on a stainless Damascus blade, and that produces a lot of hydrogen bubbles, which are going to build up on the sides of the knife. And if you're not careful, those bubbles that form on the sides of the knife are going to actually block access of the acid touching your steel. So you need agitation, and that's why I often see people using the bubblers. And in terms of agitation, yes, it will work, but it will burn through the effectiveness of the product faster. So I would recommend using a magnetic stir bar or sitting by the piece and every so often pulling it out and putting it back in, because the surface tension of the acid will strip any bubbles off before you put it back. It will still release free copper ions into itself if you are using it to etch cumide, but I imagine that the aluminium rod trick will work with that as well. But still, acids are a consumable, especially etchant acids for bladesmithing, and you're eventually going to have to replace it. But those tricks will help it last a bit longer, especially if you only make one knife every week or two like I do. So they're the options, really. You can, if you want to think about it yourself and you want to build your own vessels that contain various different stages of etchant and different types of etchant. They're the ones to choose from now that you know what they all do, and they're going to have different applications. Low layer Damascus is going to want a different surface finish to super high layer mosaic Damascus, and so on and so forth. But if you don't want to think about it, now there's a pre-made option, and if you're an Australian like me and you thought that you couldn't get it, you can now at Nordic Edge, which is really nice. Once again, not a sponsored video, but it's just nice to have access to it, because the guys at Baker Forge and Tool make a good product. I got a good result out of it. I'm quite happy with it. So yeah, that's all I really got to say. The only final trick in this is neutralization. Neutralizing your acid is super important. A lot of people will use a suspension of baking soda and water. That's really good. It's what I use. The trick is that because baking soda and water will still rust your steel, you want to fully neutralize it and then oil. Blowing the water off first is really good. What I usually do is I will wash the blade thoroughly in baking soda and water, take it out of there, spray the entire thing down with WD-40 because it's capillary and it'll go into every little nook and cranny. Once that's done, I will use compressed air to blow the whole thing as dry as possible and then pat it down with a rag. And that usually does the job quite well. So now you know more about etching Damascus than you probably wanted to. This is going to be my last video for the year, and I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for following along with the journey. I plan to do more of them in the new year. It's been a hell of a year, I'm sure you can all agree, and not in the good way. So hopefully 2025 is better. Huge thank you and shout out to all of my patrons who have helped support me and encourage me to make more videos like this, and they're really the reason that I am still doing videos at all. If you want to join, all the links are in the description below, and I hope you have a great end to your year, and I'll see you in the new one. Bye.